Hello friends, thanks for tuning in to the fourth lecture video. Today we're going to finish up our discussion of human population dynamics, and we're going to explore a couple questions. A, how can we visualize population data? B, how can countries regulate their population size? And C, how long do we live for and why? And this is a question I'm sure many of you are worried about. You're getting very old and so are worried about when the end may come. Don't worry, we will comfort you on that front. Alrighty. So, first of all, population, it's more than just a number, okay? There are some more nuances to it than just 1.7 billion or whatever. First of all, there can be differences between sexes. The male population might be slightly smaller than the female population, or vice versa. There also might be differences between different generations or different cohorts. The baby boomer generation in the United States is a great example of a generation that has a much higher population than the younger generation. Additionally, there's going to be a lot of change over time in these populations, right? It's not a static growth rate. The growth rate will fluctuate every year, and certainly every decade and every 20 years or so. So the question becomes, well, how can we visualize this? Thankfully, there's an answer. I wouldn't have brought it up if there wasn't an answer. And the answer is something called an age structure diagram or a population pyramid. Ooh, fancy. The age structure diagrams show the proportion of individuals at various ages within the population, various generations. You could look at it. I guess they're a bit smaller generations, but let's take a look at this population, this pyramid on the left here, right? So on the bottom we've got percent of population with 0 being in the middle. Okay, on the left is orange, and on the right is green. Orange represents the male population, and green represents the female population. Going up, I guess you could call it the y-axis, each different row represents a different age group. So the very bottom row represents those humans living in the 0 to 4 year age range, with a significant chunk. It looks like about 9% of the population are males within the age of 0 to 4, and about 8.5% of the population are females within the age range of 0 to 4. Right. Meanwhile, if we look later on in the age range of 45 to 49, right, a significantly smaller population, maybe about 2% are male within that age range, and maybe about 2%, maybe a little bit more, are female within that age range. Okay, so it's the same axes for each population, but each population is going to have a slightly different pyramid. Afghanistan has a different pyramid than the United States, which has a different pyramid than Italy. And the shape of these pyramids, not all of them are pyramids, obviously this is not a pyramid, but this is a pyramid. The shape of these age structure diagrams can tell you about how the population is going to grow. If it has a wider base than the tip, you know the population is growing. There's a lot of babies, there's a lot of young kids, and in 20 years they're going to start having kids, and that population is going to grow. Meanwhile, if it's sort of equal, more or less, all the way up to the top, the population is not really growing. Each generation is having the same number of kids as the generation prior to it. On the other hand, in a country like Italy, where the generations are having fewer kids than the generation before, which means the population is shrinking. So in the United States, we're going to start shifting away from this sort of zero growth or slow growth and towards an area of negative growth or no growth or even negative growth, as families tend to get smaller on average and people are having fewer kids. Like I said, there are multiple stages. This is the same thing I was just talking about. A wide base indicates rapid growth. A moderate base indicates slow growth. A pretty evenly spaced base indicates no growth. And a narrower base and a wider top indicates negative growth, because there are fewer young people being produced, and there's a lot of the older generation which will eventually die off. Here's an interesting case study looking at Bangladesh's population pyramid. They've got percentage of the population on the x-axis, males in blue, females in pink, some gender norms with these colors, and the age ranges on the y-axis. Don't worry about the numbers so much, just focus on the shape of the pyramid. As you can see, it's a pretty wide base. Rapid growth in 1990. By the time they get to 2000, a decade later, that pyramid has sort of shrunk inwards. The base has become less wide and the tip has become less narrow. So the population is still growing fast, but not as fast as it was in 1990. By 2010, another decade passed, you can see the base is now completely squeezed in, and it's actually smaller than the generation before it. And then by 2020, current years, you can see that that is even more so the case. So the population is still going to be growing as these age groups start to age over the next few decades and age into the 80-year-old range or so. But the population is not growing as fast as it once was. And this is something we can see in that Don't Panic video with Hans Rosling that I'm showing in class. Another interesting case study, I'm going to show you the pyramids for the United States from 1950 to present day in 5-year gaps. So we'll start with 1950, and I will jump ahead 5 years at a time, and just pay attention to the shape of the pyramid. Watch what happens. 1955, 1960, 1965, 1970, 1975, 1980, 1985, 1990, 1995, 2000, 2005, 2010, 2015, 2020. You see what happened to the shape of the pyramid? I'm going to go back. Woo! Okay? And we're going to do it. Now I'm going to do it really fast. Okay? So it's going to be quick. Watch what happens to the shape of the graph. The base will sort of slide upwards as the people in this age group age out. Right? People who were born in 1950 are now 70 years old today. Ready? Here we go. 3, 2, 1. Oops. Right? So you can see the population pyramid changes over time. Initially, we had a wide base. Excuse me. So the population was growing in the 50s. That's a baby boom, right? Is this bulge right here is the baby boom. Over time, it evens out, and it even gets almost looks like it could be becoming negative population growth over time because the base is narrower than higher up. The question now becomes, how do we regulate these populations, right? If the population is growing very slowly or negatively, or if it's growing very rapidly, how do we regulate it? And the answers come in a variety of ways. First of all, we could do a government-subsidized family planning, where the government provides money or tax breaks for things like birth control, sex education, birth spacing, etc. Perhaps the government will provide economic rewards or economic penalties, free healthcare for smaller families, financial bonuses at the end of each year for smaller families. If you have extra children, you're going to get taxed for each extra kid. Or free college for children who don't have any siblings, right? That might seem like a little bit prejudiced or whatever, but these are all technically valid methods of reducing population size and economic incentives. Or you could go an alternative route, raising the legal marriage age, which tends to put off the start of families until a few years later. Or you could do something like what China did, which is to have a one-child policy, right, where they only allow one child per family, or they try and enforce that as best as they can. Obviously, there are going to be some differences. Like I said earlier in the year, rural areas tend to be less enforced with this because they need help on the farm. It's less dense living area. But they limited the amount of children that each family could have. This has had some pretty significant impacts on the Chinese population and the Chinese culture, though. It's led to forced abortions, and in some areas of China, the culture values males over females, and so if the parents of a first child knew that the child was going to be female, sometimes they would get abortions. Sometimes in some areas of China, if the family was having a second child, they could be forced to get an abortion or potentially lose their job. But it's also that sort of sex discrepancy of preference of males over females has led to a bunch of bachelors, a lot of extra men who don't have women to match up with them. And I'll get to that in a second. Take a look on the x-axis. We've got year. On the y-axis, we've got total fertility rate. Look at China. 1979 is when they enact the one-child policy, but they're building up to that in the 5-10 years prior. So you can see a significant drop in the TFR, and then after the act is actually, or the one-child policy is put in place, you can see another significant drop, right? Compared to some other countries which have more gradual drops, like India, or the United States, which is high during the baby boomers, and then it drops and sort of levels out. So there's a really interesting interview with National Public Radio with a a Chinese woman named Mei Fong. She's an author of a book called One Child, and she talks a lot in that book about the one-child policy. She's got this a couple quotes I'll read from her book for you. She says, "Now China has 30 million more men than women, 30 million bachelors who cannot find brides. They call them guanguan." I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, so I apologize. But that translates to broken branches. That's the name in Chinese. They are biological dead ends of their family, which is just terribly sad thought to think about. In many cultures, not just Chinese, but all cultures around the world, family, honor, and legacy is a huge part of those cultures. And knowing that a lot of these men who don't have sort of female counterparts, so they're more men than women. And so they can't find wives and continue on their family. Now, obviously, not every family is a male and a female, right? But in the cases of producing a child biologically, right, you need a sperm and an egg to do that, right? So there's this interesting sort of cultural, societal impact of these biological dead ends, which I think is kind of a tragic outcome. Take a look at the population pyramid. We can kind of look at what she's talking about here with the more men than women, right? If we look at the population of men in China versus women, we see in the 25 to 29 age range, so 30 years old, that was in, if this is in 2020, that's in 1990. The one-child policy was started in 1970, so that would be, or 79, so that would be about in the 40 years age gap, age group, all the way to present day. Look at the numbers. 3.4 males, 3.4% males to 3.3% females. Okay, it's about the same. 3.6 to 3.4. Okay, it's starting to increase on the male side. 4.6 to 4.3. These numbers may not seem like a lot, but in a population of 1.4 billion, it sure is a lot, right? 3.6 to 3.2, there's a difference of 0.4%, right? 1% of this, 1% of 1.4 billion is about 40 billion. Right? So keep that in mind. 3.1 to 2.7, 3.2 to 2.7, 3.2 to 2.8, 3.1 to 2.7. So there are discrepancies where there are more males than females in Chinese population today. And here's another quote from her interview with NPR. She writes, or she says, "The entire population of retirees in China would be the third largest nation in the world if they were to form their own country. That has nothing to do with the one-child policy. That's just a function of people living longer and growing older. But the problem is then that you have this very small working cohort to support that population, and it has everything to do with the one-child policy. You just drastically shrank the number of working adults who support this huge aging tsunami, and that's the problem going ahead." And the point she's making is that you've got this age, the elderly population is going to be much larger than the younger population. And in all cultures, but also in China, the younger population is required or expected to take care of their elderly relatives. And if you have more elderly relatives than you do young generation, there's going to be a higher demand on the young generation to take care of the elderly. And a lot of that has to do with life expectancy. Is that people are living until they're older, living until much later ages, right? And that's what she says. It has to do nothing with the one-child policy, just a function of people living longer and growing older. What does have to do with the one-child policy is the fact that the younger generations are much smaller cohorts as a whole. But if we look at life expectancy around the world, darker pink or purple colors represent higher life expectancies, whereas lighter pink, lighter purple represent lower life expectancies. This is in 1960, okay? This is 60 years ago, and this is modern day. You can see, if I flick back and forth, or I guess this is 2010, so it's not super modern day, but it's relatively recent. If I flick back and forth between 1960 and 2010, 50 years difference, no country is becoming lighter in color, meaning that no country is having a lower life expectancy. Every country, on average, the people are living longer, and this is having dramatic impacts on the amount of elderly that we need to care for. But it's not just elderly. We tend to see differences in terms of sex, in terms of life expectancy. Females, on average, tend to live longer. There are a variety of reasons for this. There are gender-specific diseases. such as STDs. There are hazard or lifestyle choices. On average, adolescent males tend to be a bit more risk, adolescent females tend to be more risk averse. Adolescent males tend to be more likely to make big risks. Wars in many countries, including the United States, most of the military force is male, and on average, because of gender norms, most of the, quote, dangerous jobs are male-dominated, whether it's coal mining or fishing for like Deadliest Catch or whatever. So females tend to live longer because of that. Excuse me. But it's not just adults whose life expectancy is increasing. It's also infants. Infant mortality is kind of a morose, sad thing to think about, but it is a real thing. Thankfully, infant mortality is decreasing around the world. The lifespan of the individuals is increasing around the world, and therefore the lifespan or the survival rate of infants is also increasing around the world. There are a variety of factors that affect the life expectancy and mortality rate of infants. These are all things we've talked about before, all things you could probably guess, including health care or child care, prenatal care, access to education and kindergarten, the amount of food that's available, how readily accessible clean drinking water is, what is the sanitation like in the community, what is the pollution like in this community. All of these things are going to impact the ability of a baby to survive. But what underlies all of these things? That's right, money. Money comes back. Again, money is going to make healthcare better. It's going to increase access to food and water. It's going to improve sanitation and decrease pollution. So wealth is what it's all about. Wealth is the driving factor for a lot of these. So that's going to be it for this video. When thinking about population pyramids, government policies to reduce population, and life expectancy, bring questions to class, and we will go on from there. Thank you for your time. Have a wonderful day.